In 1942, the canvas walls of the field hospital fluttered softly in the hot Sicilian wind, carrying with them the smell of antiseptic, dust, and something darker that every soldier recognized but never spoke about. Private Daniel Mercer lay on a narrow cot, staring at the ceiling of the tent as if it were miles away instead of inches above his face. His uniform jacket had been folded beside him, stiff with dried sweat and dirt from the hills outside Jela. Around him, other men lay silent or muttered in their sleep, some clutching blankets even though the August heat pressed down like a weight. The doctors called it battle fatigue. Most of the soldiers simply called it being broken. Mercer hadn't always felt this way. Only a week earlier he had been moving with his unit through dusty olive groves under the hard Sicilian sun, the crack of rifles echoing across stone walls and dry fields. But the constant shelling, the screams, the endless waiting for the next explosion had slowly hollowed him out. One moment he had been standing behind a ruined farmhouse with the rest of his squad. The next moment he couldn't stop shaking. His rifle had slipped from his hands, and no matter how hard he tried, his fingers refused to close around it again. The medics brought him here along with several others whose nerves had snapped under the strain. The doctors spoke quietly as they examined him, using careful words like exhaustion and stress. Mercer didn't argue with them. He was simply relieved to be away from the gunfire, even if only for a few hours. Across the tent, another soldier sat hunched forward on his cot. Private Charles Cole stared at the ground, his helmet resting loosely in his hands. Every few seconds his foot tapped the dirt floor as if he were trying to run without leaving the spot. Mercer had watched him for nearly an hour without either of them saying a word. The quiet didn't last long. Outside the tent, boots crunched on gravel with a sharp rhythm that made several men turn their heads. Voices rose briefly in greeting before falling silent again. Then the flap of the hospital tent was pulled aside. The man who stepped inside looked as if he had walked straight out of a recruiting poster. His uniform was spotless despite the dust of Sicily. The ivory-handled revolvers at his hips caught the light. Even the way he moved seemed sharp and purposeful, like a man who believed the entire war was a problem that could be solved simply by pushing harder. General George S. Patton had arrived. For a moment no one spoke. The doctors stiffened slightly, unsure why the general had come into a place meant for men who had already reached their limits. Patton's eyes moved quickly across the rows of cots. They were cold, searching, impatient. His gaze stopped on Cole. "What's wrong with that man?" Patton demanded. A doctor stepped forward carefully. "Battle fatigue, sir." The words seemed to hang in the air like an insult. Patton stepped closer to the cot, looking down at the trembling soldier. Cole didn't raise his head. His fingers tightened around his helmet as if he could disappear inside it. "Battle fatigue?" Patton repeated. His voice hardened. "There's nothing wrong with him except cowardice." Mercer felt the tension ripple through the room. The other soldiers watched from their cots, too shocked to move. Patton's anger rose quickly, like a storm breaking. He leaned forward and slapped Cole across the face with a sharp crack that echoed against the canvas walls. "You're a coward," Patton snapped. "You're bringing disgrace to this army." Cole flinched, his shoulders shrinking inward. The doctor tried to step between them, but Patton brushed him aside with the confidence of a man who had never believed in hesitation. "Get him back to the front," Patton ordered. "I won't have soldiers like this hiding in hospitals." Mercer felt his stomach twist. The slap itself had been shocking, but the look on Cole's face afterward was worse. It wasn't anger or shame. It was the hollow expression of someone who had already fallen apart long before the general arrived. Patton turned and walked out of the tent just as abruptly as he had entered. The sounds of his boots faded quickly into the afternoon heat. For several seconds no one moved. Then the doctor exhaled slowly and rubbed his forehead. The nurses whispered among themselves, their voices tight with disbelief. A few soldiers stared at the ground, as if trying to erase what they had just seen. Mercer lay back on his cot and stared at the ceiling again. But the fragile quiet that had filled the tent earlier was gone. Something had changed. In the days that followed, The story spread through the army like wildfire. Soldiers repeated it in mess lines, in foxholes, and in the shadows of ruined buildings. Some defended the general, saying he demanded strength because war demanded it. Others said nothing at all, but the silence carried its own meaning. Patton continued pushing his armies forward across Sicily with relentless speed. Town after town fell as American units advanced through the dusty hills and narrow roads. On the maps in headquarters tents, the movement looked impressive, bold, even brilliant. But for many soldiers, the memory of that moment in the hospital lingered longer than any victory. Weeks later, when word came that Dwight D. Eisenhower had forced Patton to apologize, Mercer heard the news while sitting beside a campfire with the rest of his unit. Someone read the announcement aloud from a crumpled piece of paper. A few men nodded. Others simply stared into the flames. The apology might have satisfied the officers who needed order and discipline to keep an army moving. But for the soldiers who had seen what happened inside that hospital tent, the moment had already carved itself into memory. Long after the war would be remembered for battles and victories, Mercer suspected many men would remember something else entirely. They would remember the day a general walked into a hospital and mistook broken soldiers for cowards. The rain had turned the Italian hillside into a slow-moving river of mud. Private Isaiah Carter wiped the grit from his eyes and tried to steady his breathing as artillery thunder rolled across the valley. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division had been climbing the same ridge for hours, slipping between broken stone walls and shell holes while German machine guns hammered the slopes above them. Carter had grown up in Louisiana, cutting cane in fields that seemed endless in summer heat, but even those days had never felt as long as this climb. Every few yards another man dropped to the ground, some wounded, some simply exhausted. The officers shouted orders over the gunfire, but the hillside itself seemed determined to push them back. When the attack finally stalled, the survivors crawled behind a crumbling farmhouse to catch their breath. Later, they would hear the reports written far from the battlefield by Edward Almond, their division commander, describing the operation as another example of the unit's unreliability. Carter remembered the moment one of the sergeants read those words aloud days afterward. The men sitting in silence as if they had been accused of a crime they didn't understand. They knew the truth was buried somewhere in the mud of those hills, in the broken radios, the missing artillery support, and the impossible ground they had been ordered to take. But the reports moving up the chain of command said something simpler. The soldiers were the problem. And once those words were written, it felt as though the verdict had already been decided. Winter winds swept across the frozen fields of Eastern Europe as the remnants of a German infantry company crouched inside a shattered barn. The war had long since turned against them, but the orders from above had only grown harsher. Their commander was Ferdinand Schorner, a man who believed that retreat meant betrayal. At first, the soldiers treated the rumors about executions as exaggerated stories meant to frighten them into discipline. But one morning, as the company moved along a muddy road lined with leafless trees, they saw the proof hanging there in the cold air. A soldier's body swung from a branch with a sign pinned to his chest accusing him of desertion. No one spoke as they marched past. From that day on, the threat stopped feeling theoretical. Exhausted men who could barely stand were forced forward again and again, because falling back without permission meant risking the same fate. Even the wounded were viewed with suspicion. The officers said the army had to hold the line no matter the cost, and so the soldiers waited for the moment when retreat might finally be allowed. It never came. Then, in the final weeks of the war, a strange story spread through the ranks like wildfire. Schorner himself had vanished, removing his uniform and slipping away as the front collapsed around him. The men he had ruled through fear were left to face the enemy alone, some surrendering, others dying where they stood. For them, the message was impossible to ignore. Loyalty had been demanded with threats and executions. But when the end arrived, the man who demanded it most had disappeared. Thousands of miles away in the humid jungles of the Pacific, Corporal Thomas Hale leaned against a palm tree and stared out across the dark water of a narrow channel. His unit had just finished clearing a small island bypass during the Allied advance. The Japanese garrison had been cut off weeks earlier, yet they had fought stubbornly from caves and bunkers carved into the rock. The battle had taken days of slow, brutal work with flamethrowers and grenades. Hale wiped sweat from his neck and watched the sun sink behind the hills, thinking about the larger war unfolding far beyond this tiny patch of jungle. The strategy guiding those operations belonged to Douglas MacArthur, the American commander directing campaigns across the Pacific War. MacArthur's leapfrogging approach meant bypassing heavily defended islands and striking where the enemy was weaker. On maps in distant headquarters, the strategy looked elegant and efficient. But soldiers like Hale often found themselves returning to those bypassed islands anyway, fighting isolated garrisons that refused to surrender. The jungle was thick with insects and disease, and every cave could hide another ambush. Hale had never seen MacArthur in person, though the general's photographs appeared often in newspapers and briefings, standing confidently beside maps or aircraft. The soldiers rarely questioned the overall strategy. Many knew it had helped push the war forward faster. Still, as Hale and the others buried another fallen comrade beneath the shadow of the palms, some of them wondered whether the distance between headquarters and the battlefield had grown too large. From the jungle floor, the victories announced in press conferences felt far away, while the war itself remained stubbornly close. The rain had been falling for 2 days across the muddy Soviet trenches in Crimea, turning the earth into thick gray paste that clung to boots and rifles alike. Sergeant Alexei Morozov stood on the edge of the half-finished defensive line, watching exhausted soldiers drive shovels into the soaked soil. They had worked all night building these trenches, deep enough to stop tanks, strong enough to hold if the Germans attacked again. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they might survive the next assault. Then the order arrived. No more trenches. The men thought it was a mistake. Officers argued quietly over the paper until someone finally spoke the name that made the argument stop. Lev Mekles. He had arrived from Moscow with authority greater than the generals themselves. By the afternoon, the shovels were silent. The defensive works were abandoned, and the soldiers were ordered forward instead, across open ground where the wind carried the distant rumble of German artillery. Morozov had fought long enough to recognize the feeling in his stomach. Not fear of the enemy, fear of the plan. Weeks later, when the German offensive finally began, the sky erupted with artillery so heavy the ground trembled like an earthquake. Without trenches or prepared lines, the Soviet divisions had nowhere to hide and nowhere to fall back. Tanks rolled through the smoke, and the infantry came behind them in endless gray waves. Morozov watched entire companies disappear under bombardment before they even fired a shot. Radios screamed for orders that never came. Retreat paths had never been planned. By the time the chaos ended, the army that had filled the valleys of Crimea was gone. Nearly 170,000 men were dead, wounded, or marching into captivity. Morozov was one of the few who escaped through the hills at night, carrying a wounded lieutenant on his shoulders while the fires of destroyed equipment burned behind them like a dying horizon. Weeks later, he heard something whispered among the survivors. Mekles himself had admitted he wasn't a military professional. Morozov laughed when he heard it, a hollow sound that startled even him. They had already known that. Years later, on the other side of the world, Corporal Daniel Harris crouched in the coral dust of a tiny island in the Pacific, staring at cliffs that looked like broken teeth rising from the jungle. His commander, William H. Rupertus, had promised the battle would last 3 days. Harris repeated the number to himself whenever the artillery stopped long enough for silence to return. 3 days. By the 4th week, the Marines had stopped counting time. The caves were everywhere. Every ridge, every rocky slope hid another machine gun or sniper waiting for them to move. The Japanese defenders had turned the island into a fortress of tunnels and stone. Harris watched platoons advance only to vanish under sudden fire from holes no one had seen before. At night, the wounded cried out across the dark battlefield while medics crawled through shell craters trying to reach them. 3 days had become 2 months. Across the ocean in Europe, another promise was collapsing. Deep inside the frozen ruins of the Battle of Stalingrad, German soldiers stared upward whenever aircraft engines echoed through the clouds. They were told supplies would arrive from the air. The promise had come from Hermann Göring himself. But the cargo planes rarely made it through the Soviet fighters and winter storms. The men waiting in the ruins rationed bullets and bread while the snow buried bodies along the shattered streets. Private Lucas Weber remembered the moment his unit opened a crate that had finally arrived by parachute. Inside were medical bandages and propaganda leaflets. No food. No ammunition. Around him, the soldiers stared silently into the box, as if it were a cruel joke sent from the sky. Far to the east, in the jungles near India, another army marched into disaster. Renya Mutaguchi believed his offensive would break British defenses and change the war in Asia. Instead, the jungle swallowed his soldiers. Monsoon rains washed out supply roads. Pack animals died in the mud. Hunger crept through the ranks like a disease long before the enemy attacked. Some units reached the battlefield already starving. One of those soldiers, a young rifleman named Kenji Sato, realized the truth while staring at a pot of boiling grass meant to pass as soup. They had marched hundreds of miles to fight a battle they no longer had the strength to win. Elsewhere, pride shaped battles in quieter but equally deadly ways. In Italy, Mark Clark redirected his army toward the prize of Rome while German forces slipped away to fight another day. In North Africa, Lloyd Fredendall commanded from a bunker far from the front, issuing orders so confusing that entire units were caught unprepared during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The soldiers fighting those battles never met each other. Morozov in the Soviet steppe, Harris on the Coral Island, Weber in the frozen ruins, Sato in the jungle. They lived in different armies, different languages, different uniforms. Yet their stories followed the same pattern. Plans built on pride. Promises that ignored reality. Orders written far from the gunfire. And on every battlefield, it was the soldiers who paid the price.